Okay, well, I suppose good evening and welcome along to this episode of In Conservation With. And tonight I'm joined by a writer who, I have to be honest, I've not known of much before, and I've read some of her work over the last couple of days, and I think she's amazing. Kathryn Aalto, thank you very much for coming along today. And the reason why I actually came to you and sort of asked you to come on was that I saw your book and, your new book, and I loved the idea behind it. I just wondered if you can would you mind just showing the book for a second? So there you go, Writing Wild. It's quite a long title, isn't it, really?
Yeah, it's called Writing Wild, and then the subtitle is Women Poets, Ramblers, and Mavericks Who Shape How We See the Natural World.
Right, well, I saw that title and I was immediately drawn to it because I think it's really interesting talking about women in nature, because obviously at the moment there's a lot of talk about people of colour in nature, and I think in reality both go hand in hand because both have had misrepresentations. But before we actually sort of delve into the book, I'd like to know a little bit more about you, Kathryn. Obviously you were born, well not obviously, because you could have been born somewhere else, but you were born in California, am I wrong?
That's right.
And you are currently living in the UK. What was it like growing up in California?
Well, first, thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here, and I see everybody joining in. So hello, everybody. It's nice to see you. Hi, I'm waving to everybody. So I'm a California girl. You hear a California accent. And I live in Exeter now, down in Devon. I spent most of I was born down in the LA area, and I spent most of my years until I went to university in the Central Valley in California. And the Central Valley, if any of you have been there, many British folk I do meet and wonder about my accent. They wonder where I'm from, and I say I'm from the San Francisco area. And they'll say, oh, I've been to San Francisco, I've been to Yosemite National Park. And I say, you've probably been right through my hometown, which is about 90 miles between Yosemite and San Francisco. So I grew up in what's called the breadbasket of the world. And in my small town of Escalon, California, it's about 7,000 people now, but it was about 5,000 when I was growing up. It's called the land of peaches and cream. There are peach orchards and almond orchards, cornfields. It's big ag. And so any sort of, we have a few national wildlife areas, which are for birds passing through from the south up to the north. But otherwise, it was sort of a big cultivated landscape. And then I went to university at Berkeley, which is about a very different area than where I grew up. Conservative political Trump country is where I grew up, and I went to university at probably one of the most radical universities in the United States and progressive, which is Berkeley. And so I became really interested in what came before in the Central Valley, before the cultivated landscape. And I found out more about it through the writings of John Muir. And from there, he did a walk from San Francisco to Yosemite National Park. I think in the 1880s, early 1890s. And that particular essay really got me interested in natural history, essays that had to do with walking on foot, and environmental history through the personal essay. And from there, I ended up teaching American Literature of Nature and Place, and then leaving America for work in 2007. So I've been down here in lovely Devon for about 13 years.
Now, I want to ask you about Devon in a minute. And basically, I've had experience of California in that in my past, I used to be a PA to a director that made music videos and commercials. And I used to go to LA every year for 13 years on the trot, sometimes spending up to 3 months there. So I kind of really got to know LA in a big way. And I had a few local patches that I used to go birding in. And I also had some really nice friends there who were birders. That was good. And also, I've been to San Francisco once, and I was hanging around in the Bay Area, for example, because you've got an interesting species of rail that's been split, ridgeway's whale, which is split from the clapper rail, I think. So I went to see that bird. That was quite interesting. So
amazing.
yeah, so I've had a bit of experience in California. So now you're in UK. Do you miss America at all?
Not now, not politically, not no. I mean, it's a bit of a. I have 3 kids. We have 3 kids, and all 3 of them will be in the United States going to school next year. 2 of them go to school right now, university in Boston and Rhode Island, and another one will be going to school in Exeter, New Hampshire. So we live in the original Exeter, and he'll be going. So I'm like, oh, my children. Well, no, I mean, no, well, what, there are things I miss. I miss, you can be killed and eaten by charismatic megafauna, by bears and cougars. And I mean, you can die in the United States from something attacking you. Less so in Devon, you know, I might fall off a cliff but nothing, I feel really safe here as a woman walking. And I love the public footpaths that we have. And I mean, they are a national treasure here, and not as many landscapes in the world have these footpaths. So I'm a very serious walker. Just the casual meander. I mean, I do run and do all that in the morning, but I love just wandering. So we just don't have that in the United States. We have private property laws, and we're a big car culture and cattle culture, lots of barbed wire and lots of highways. So I'm impressed. I'm really interested in what's going on with the protests. So, and I think we've reached a breaking point where things will change. And so I'm excited. It's awful what happened to George Floyd, but there's a revolution underfoot. And I'm watching it from afar. If I was at Berkeley, I would be in those protests.
Do you think there's going to be real change? Because, you know, many Black people have died over the years, and there has been protests before. Admittedly, this is a different type of protest, I can see that. But do you actually feel that there's going to be a change? Do you think that, for example, Mr. whatever his name is, the president, do you think he will be re-elected, for example?
Well, we can't ever underestimate the man who's in the office. I cannot put the president and the Trump together. I cannot. So polls are showing that he is behind by about 13 to 15 points. So it looks like he's going to be a one-termer, but you never know what evil sort of tricks can happen with him. So I don't know, but I think that a lot of people are, I think independent, if you break everything down, it looks like a lot of middle-class white women who voted for him are not going to be voted, are fleeing because they're just disgusted with everything. So I'm glad I'm here, and I hope he's not reelected.
Yes.
Does everyone agree with me?
I'm sure they do. How did you spend lockdown, by the way? How's lockdown for you?
Oh, well, I'd love to hear how lockdown's been for you, because I know you've been birding down in where you live. Lockdown has been interesting for me because I'm free of the school run, so I don't have to deliver our youngest to school. He's 16, and what it's meant is that I love the dawn chorus. I love songbirds in the morning. And because I had the school run, I couldn't often leave when I wanted to. So what's happened is I started running a lot more, and I used to be a more serious runner years ago, and so I've been working on my calf muscles and my ankle architecture, and I've been running long distances and running all the way to the estuary, and
Nice.
And seeing all sorts of wonderful new birds that we just don't have up in the hills outside near the university. Sedge warblers, and I've gotten to know, the most wonderful thing is getting to know all the birders who are out in the morning. I'm involved in I'm newly involved in a Facebook group of birders along this. I run along the ship canal, which was built in about 1563. So it attracts all sorts of wildlife that we just don't see here. So I've been dealing with lockdown okay, but when a male swan was attacked by a bird and left behind 4 cygnets, and a mother bird, a duckling, a mother duck with 10 ducklings I found in a pond disappeared after they slowly diminished. I had a really hard time with birds disappearing, and when that happened, I had kind of emotional breakdowns at the ship canal. It's like, so I think I was suppressing things, but when birds disappeared who had become my friends, and I watched them build nests, and then they disappeared, I spent a lot of time crying along the river or the canal.
Oh, well, for me, I spent a lot of time crying at home because the lockdown here in Spain was pretty draconian.
Yeah.
It was earlier than Britain. In fact, Britain had a lockdown light as far as I was concerned. No exercise for probably about 60 odd days, other than walking down to the shop, which was literally 5 minutes walk for me. So it became I'm lucky because I got an apartment here in a city called Mérida, which is in a region called Extremadura, which is the 5th largest region in Spain of the 17 regions they have. It's kind of sandwiched between Madrid and Seville, and it borders to the west Portugal. So it's totally inland. It's twice the size of Wales, and I believe just a little bit smaller than Kentucky. So it's a fairly big.
You're very specific.
It's a fairly big place, but the city I live in, which is the capital, there's only 70,000 people. A city is actually a stretch to call it that. I mean, there's very few high-rise buildings, which I love. It's all fairly low-rise. It's like a huge village, and it was tough. Part of the tough element for me was not being able to get out. I mean, I got a sun terrace, but a sun terrace view is looking over rooftops and chimneys and satellite dishes, not a lick of green anywhere. I mean, I was seeing birds, passing over like vultures and what have you, which is great, but I wasn't actually getting that much more injection of nature. So when I was, at my lowest, it was really tough because I was running out of power, basically, because I get power from the environment, from being outside, getting the energy from nature, and I was running out of power. I didn't realize how much that it would affect me, because I thought at first, that the first couple of weeks, I thought, oh, it's fine, But then, as it dragged on, it got worse and worse. And what made it particularly bad was ringing up or speaking to people in England who were moaning, oh God, it's awful, it's terrible, I feel absolutely caged in. Anyway, I'm going out for a walk now, see you later. And I'm thinking, I can't even go for a walk, So it was pretty tough.
But it makes you think, doesn't it, about how much wildlife and birding and the natural world helps you cope with normal living, doesn't it?
It does, because, I'm aware, more than a lot of people, I suppose, who aren't interested in nature. I'm very aware of it, but I didn't realize how much I needed it. And I'm so happy that I live in an apartment of my own, which is big. I feel sorry for the families in Spain who are used to living on the street, as it were, because they're very sociable people, they're always out. And to be confined for so long and the kids not being able to get out for exercise, yet they did it, with dignity. There wasn't any uprisings anywhere. There wasn't any dominant coming moments, people going out and doing what they wanted to do. Nothing like that happened at all. It's much more sort of under control here. So, but I'm glad.
It's out of control in the US because people believe we have this independent streak, and how dare the government tell us that we need to wear masks, and it's resulting in chaos.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that you were, I don't know, I think England is in middle between the United States and Spain, but I admire the Spaniards and the Italians and the French who were in a lockdown, very serious lockdowns, and people did suffer mentally. Yeah. It makes you savor what we do have.
Exactly, because when I did get my freedom, I remember the morning of the day when we had allowed to have an hour's exercise. I was standing by the door at 5 to 6, because we had 1 hour between 6 and 10 a.m. And I felt agoraphobic, I felt emotional, I felt scared. I felt all these things that I never expected. And I went out into the street in the dark, walking into the countryside, feeling very exposed and feeling as if I could be stopped at any moment. I ended up walking for 3.5 hours. And I walked so much and so far. I didn't realize, no one told me, but if you don't walk for 60 days, there's muscles you haven't used for ages. And my hips seized up and my Achilles went. So by the time I came back, I was hobbling and I couldn't walk for a week after that. So it was an experience, I must say.
We are meant to move, aren't we?
Exactly, we are. And even though I took up yoga, which I don't like at all, I must put out there, I don't like yoga whatsoever, but yoga saved me because it really helped my hips and it just helped me to sort of get at least partially fit. But anyway, we are here to talk about writing wild, women poet ramblers and mavericks who shape how we see the natural world. And I know this isn't really a book review and it's not a literary sort of conversation in terms of talking about, you know, how you, well, we're going to talk about how you wrote it, but I'm more interested in behind all things. I'm interested in how you got to write it, basically. But in this book, you celebrate 25 women, both historical and current, whose influential writing helps deepen our connection to nature. So I'd like to find out, you know, I think the first question is, why did you actually come to write this?
Well, I've had a long interest in nature writing because I like to read about the natural world in a field guide like you do, you know, in birding books, but I like personal narratives. So I like walking, I like to feel like I'm walking along and I tend to learn better that way. So I really like the personal sense of learning about the natural world through personal narratives. So it's been a professional interest. You know, I'm an essayist, so I study the essay, and these are 25 essays. So as a form, you know, I write creative nonfiction, and so it's just a series of 25 essays where I explore the lives, what do we say? Lives, literature, landscapes, and legacies of these 25 women. And it came about, it's a long story. I'll just give you a brief version. So I've always been interested, listening for narratives by women, and I realized teaching, well, when I was at university, when I took a nature writing course, it was just all dead white guys. I mean, a few living guys. And I just sort of accepted that. And it wasn't until my late 20s, decades ago, that I realized that where are the women? Like, were women not like walking and not why weren't women publishing? Why weren't women writing? Were they, what have I missed? What about people of color? I did study Native American literature as an undergraduate in my university days, so I was aware of Native American voices quite clearly. But so basically, about 3 years ago, I read an article in Outside Magazine, and it was called something like I forget the title, but it was about 25 books all well-read travelers should read. And I looked, and I noticed first when it was published, 2003, and then I briefly, you know, read the article, and 22 out of the 25 books were by white guys. And I just said, this is 2016. And I wrote a snarky response to Outside Magazine on Twitter, and I said, I could do better, you know, like, and they said, well, why don't you? And I said, I'll do that. And so I did that. And I spent, about 6 months thinking about it. I was designing gardens and teaching and doing other things. But so I spent a bit of time, and I realized I needed to go farther back than I had been taught. And I needed to include new voices, not new to people in academia and not new to people who really enjoy nature writing, but to the average person. Like, so I included women of color. I included a woman named Carolyn Finney. Well, anyway, I don't need to go into that. The book got a big response on social media. And so my publisher said, are you writing a book on that? And if not, let's do it. And so I wrote this book, and this book has just come out last week here, well, in the United States, and in June here in the UK. So I was interested basically in more diversity, and And then I discovered all sorts of amazing things. Like what were the barriers and the bullying and the biases that we had to overcome to simply write an essay about being in the natural world. So that's how it came about.
Well, I've looked at that book. I must admit, I've not had the physical copy yet, so I've had it on a download. And I really, love your style of writing. I think it's really engaging. I love the fact that you seem to go on a journey with each of the writers, even though obviously a lot of them are dead or some of them are dead. You've actually retraced their footsteps to where they came from or where they made their discoveries or have you, and interlace that with their story, which was really interesting. I mean, for example, Jean Stratton Porter, which is a woman that when I spoke to you've indicated that I need to look into. And it's quite interesting because she's an artist. She was an artist, a naturalist, a novelist, a photographer, a movie producer. She seemed like a bit of a pioneer. Can you tell us a little bit about her? She's obviously featured in the book.
Well, all the listeners here, I hope you're all birders. You probably are. If you don't know who Jean Stratton Porter is, you're going to love learning more about her. Let me just say, I'm at my desk, and this is Smithsonian Magazine here, and I wrote an article about, oh, there it is, on Jean. There she is. For Smithsonian, and I mentioned that because you can go and learn more about her by clicking on Smithsonian and Kathryn Aalto. I was given about 5,000 words to write about her, but in this Writing Wild, I wrote about 2,000 words about her. So Jean Stratton Porter is this amazing birder. She grew up in Indiana in the Midwest, and can I take a minute to talk a little bit more about Jean? I'm so excited about her.
I'll give you 2 minutes.
Okay, I'll take a few minutes. Basically, in Indiana, she lived in an area that was being cleared for cornfields and soybean fields. And she lived near one of the last swamps and wetlands before the hardwood forest was cut down and made into furniture. So the area was called the Limberlost. And she grew up on a farm where her father would just kill birds that were annoying. For example, a red-tailed hawk, her father once shot down, and she heard the shot and ran after and found this bird on the ground, and her father was about to shoot it again, and she leapt in between the bird and her father and said, "Let me take care of this bird." And she did, and the poor bird, a wild red-tailed hawk, became like a dog that followed her around. And whenever it saw other birds, hawks in the air, it would scream out, but it couldn't fly anymore. Anyway, she developed a real interest in learning how to listen carefully to birds. And her parents would call her the little bird girl, and she became known as the bird lady. Fast forward, she was a J.K. Rowling of a century ago. She wrote 26 books, nature novels, slightly sappy nature novels that were made into films. She was the first photographer ever, male or female, to photograph live birds. And most men who took photographs of birds would shoot them, stuff them, and pose them. So she was a pioneer in photography, and she got that recognition and awards and so forth. She wrote, my favorite writing of hers is about moths and the birds of the Limberlost, because you see her as this intrepid turn-of-the-century woman wearing trousers and carrying a shotgun, and her husband supported her. He said, "Yeah, go ahead and enjoy the birds and the moths." And she was one of the first practitioners of creative nonfiction, putting yourself in the narrative, and it's so lively. And then she was one of the first, if not the first, woman in Hollywood to establish a film production studio, and her books were made into films. So Jean is short for Geneva Stratton Porter, was an absolute maverick, one of my favorite women. Every woman was my favorite woman to write about, but I spent time in the Limberlost, and what they've done now is today you can go to a restored area, and when I was there were bald eagles flying around overhead, and they were extirpated, meaning they were almost extinct, but they've come back, and all sorts of other birds, and it's filled with wildflowers, and it's a tall grass prairie again. So Jean is a particularly interesting person because I wrote about Dorothy Wordsworth and Susan Fenimore Cooper before Jean, but then around the turn of the century, Jean was just doing so many amazing things that I had to include her. So for you birders, do check out Jean Stratton Porter.
She sounded amazing. I mean, what I loved about the book was the actual portraits you have, the vignettes of the women. They all seem strong and elegant compared to how you kind of envisaged them or even saw them in the past as being kind of timid, and you know, they were portrayed almost like they were timid. But do you think that women have a different approach to the appreciation of nature than to men?
That's a good question. I don't, well, there have been studies on how men and women write. Do you mean like writing or actually innately sensing it?
Let's go for both.
Both? Okay. Well, research has shown that when like college men are asked to describe the contents of their dorm room, or asked to describe their dorm room, they'll kind of list the contents of their dorm rooms. And these are general studies that scholars, academics have performed on how men and women write differently. Women tend to describe their dorm rooms by making interconnections between the objects. So this is research that's been done. So I'm making a generalization that when women write, we tend to make more connections between things. So it's possible that when we write about nature that we might be more interested in interconnections, sort of talking about the web of life, the interconnections between ecosystems and our feelings with different landscapes that we're walking through. This is not to say that men can't be maternal toward the landscape or nurturing toward the landscape. Some people have asked me, do men and women write differently about the natural world? And I would say in general, not, except when, you know, in this area of making interconnections between things. Some people will say, oh, women will write in the personal voice more, or I'll tell you, one critic said of my book, that you're breaking the wall between yourself and the reader. And I would say that's not because I'm a woman, it's because I'm using a device in creative nonfiction, which is, it's just a personal narrative. When I'm quite conversational, that doesn't mean I'm not, it's a highly researched book, but I think academics books tend not to reach as wide of an audience. And so I'm trying to make the book highly accessible. So I'm breaking kind of the fourth wall between myself and the reader. So readers are on a journey with me. But you know, Henry David Thoreau was doing it in 1854 when he wrote Walden. John Muir did it, and other writers as well do it. So it's not, I would say, a male or female thing. It's just a device I use. I hope that roughly answers your question, David.
Yeah, it does. It does. I mean, do you think? I mean, another question that has played on my mind is: do you think we're programmed with sexist ideas when it comes to nature writers? Do you think that we think that it's got to be a guy writing a book on nature?
Yep, I would say so. I would say I accepted that because I didn't have other voices around, and there are actually parallels between being a woman and being a person of color as well. That there have been barriers and biases and bullying. If I could just take a moment to tell you about, so at the beginning, for example, why was Henry David Thoreau's book Walden? I'm sure many of you have read it. It was published in 1854, and Thoreau is considered the father of American environmentalism. But in 1850, Susan Fenimore Cooper, she's the daughter of James Fenimore Cooper, who is considered America's first novelist. He wrote oh, I'm blanking on some of his books right now, but he, The Last of the Mohicans, for example, he wrote. So they lived in Cooperstown, New York. And Susan was not able to use I. Women could not use the personal pronoun when in writing. It was considered inappropriate. And in this age of selfies, when everybody, I don't, but people take selfies, and we're so used to putting ourselves out there. But in the past, it wasn't, it was considered ill-mannered to put the I in your writing, especially for a woman. British and European women could not walk alone. We had to be chaperoned by men, our brothers, fathers, sons, uncles, grandfathers. So we couldn't walk alone, or we might suffer from reputational anxiety, like being accused of being sort of an easy, sexually promiscuous woman. But Dorothy Wordsworth did. And she got all sorts of reprimanding letters from relatives saying, you need to stop walking at midnight under the moonlight. It's not safe, and what kind of reputation are you going to have? And she just didn't care. So she really inspired her brother, William Wordsworth, with her wonderfully wild nature and so forth. The other thing is it's been publishing has been very male dominated. And less so now, but it's still a white dominated field, that's for sure. So we've had a lot of barriers to overcome, from using the word I, to walking alone, to also everybody knows this, everyone knows anonymous was always a woman. We couldn't use our names on books either. So now, mind you, these are for white women. Imagine being a Black woman, a freed slave. And you were not going to be out in the wilderness. And if you were a Black man, and you were accused of looking twice at a white girl or a white woman, you could be lynched. It's so for white people, we've had the privilege of being in the landscape differently than Black people. And I don't know if you want to talk about this, David, at all during our conversation, but these are all barriers there, and bullying and safety issues that we've had to overcome.
Yeah, it's interesting because in the book you talked about description of you talked about the poplar, the tree, and how it represents different things. If you were white, it's a lovely tree, but if you're Black, and you quoted Billie Holiday, Strange Fruit, it's a tree that, was associated with lynching and other things. So it's interesting.
Can I read that paragraph?
Yeah, sure, please.
I know we were going to do a reading, but I think that's a good paragraph. Is that from the Carolyn Finney essay? I think it is. Sorry, I have to get to it.
Well, while you get to it, let me just tell you one more thing, and that is to do with the customs in terms of women. When I was in Serbia, I learned of an old custom when it came to women, and that was if you're walking down the road back in the 1800s with a woman, you always were on her left in case you needed to draw your sword to protect her with your right. And whenever you walked into a bar or restaurant, you had the woman stand a meter behind you. You walk into the restaurant first to make sure there weren't any chairs flying before inviting a woman in.
There are parallels. So I'll just read to you. This is from I'll just read one paragraph. Gender, race, and physical abilities are also important prisms through which to understand how people access and experience the natural world. If you're white, for example, a poplar tree in a park may look innocuous, an innocent object of beauty. Imagine that you are unable to reach it over a rocky trail. If you are disabled and cannot access its shade or touch its leaves, how might your relationship to the tree change? If you are Black, that same tree might have a more sinister feel, perhaps a symbol of lynching's legacy. Think of jazz star Billie Holiday's haunting rendition of the song Strange Fruit. Within a musical landscape of minor chords, Holiday transports us to the gallant South and a lynching scene where bodies swing like fruit from trees, leaves and roots soaked in blood. It's a vivid example of how perspective colors experience. If we don't give diverse narratives first the opportunity to exist, and second, recognition and legitimacy, it can appear that able-bodied white guys have, in the words of comedian Hannah Gadsby, a monopoly on the human experience.
That's pretty powerful. It's interesting because, you know, Kathryn and I spoke yesterday, actually. Was it yesterday? I think it was, yeah. And one of the things I talked about with you then was the fact that in history, women have never been credited for anything when it comes to natural history. I mean, for example, the Royal Society for Protection of Birds, the biggest conservation organization in the world, was formed in the 1800s, late 1800s, by 6 women from Didsbury in Manchester. Where are their statues? Where are they mentioned or credited anywhere? The mother of paleontology, Mary Anning, another woman who basically discovered, you know, stuff from along the Jurassic coast, you know, dinosaur bones, what have you. She was swept aside because A, she's a woman, and B, she wasn't from an academic background. I think it's, you know, it's terrible. Zoomers, you must have burning questions to ask Kathryn. Anyone with a question at this point?
That's all right. I see everyone smiling.
We'll carry on then. So
if
yeah.
you do have questions, just send them along. You can interrupt.
Yeah, it's fine. You know, it's good.
Yeah, but I have to say, David, what is the RSPB like now? Is it diverse, and are there more than men involved in it, or what can you say about?
Well, I think they've worked along with other NGOs. They've worked hard to try and make it more diverse. I mean, there's certainly more women, but a lot of the NGOs in the UK especially, but certainly elsewhere, the people at the top are men. That said, the RSPB, the current MD or whatever you want to call it, CEO, she's a woman, which is good. And there's been women CEOs in the past for the RSPB. But in terms of diversity, in terms of people of colour, it's woefully poor. I mean, all of the NGOs, as far as I can see. I mean, there's some, for example, like the London Wildlife Trust, the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust is another one I can think of, where not only are they trying to engage more people of colour in a really active way, but they also have those people of colour working with them as well. But I've always been saying, you know, you can't fish from a pool that has no fish, because, you know, it's all very well people sort of pointing fingers at the NGOs saying, you haven't got enough people of colour, what's going on? You should be, you know, employing more. So then they panic, knee jerk, and they start to sort of just try and hire anyone of colour. When in reality, I think the problem stems way back to when people are young and they're not being educated in the ways of nature, and they face cultural barriers. I mean, I had someone the other day on the talk I had with an MP, the Green Party MP, Caroline Lucas, and he said, and he was a person of colour, he said that, you know, my parents told me, my grandparents told me, don't get involved in nature because it's not for you. So, you know, that's the barrier right there. Yeah. So basically, it's called, I think it's about education. It's about getting kids educated much more than they are about the importance of the environment and conservation and nature. So they got it in them from a very early stage. And I also think feel very strongly about this. This is something that's not really discussed when I see discussions on TV about this or on Twitter and what have you. And that is the role of the media. Because as far as I'm concerned, the media portray nature and conservation and the countryside as the domain of white middle-class people. They do nothing at all to try and change that. Even now, you turn on the TV and there's still a predominantly white middle-class male presenting programs about wildlife. You go to, you know, you watch TV and watch programs about Africa, it's a white middle-class male presenting with black guys carrying his stuff for him. And I'm thinking, hang on, that looks familiar in terms of what happened, you know, when people first went to Africa. So I think the changes have to occur there, as well as, you know, they've got to come from the top as well as trickle upwards at the same time.
People need to feel listened to. People need to feel welcomed in different organizations, and not just sort of it can't be tokenism, you know. I should call attention, I focus on 3 Black writers in Writing Wild, and this book here, I want to recommend it to everybody. It's called Black Faces, White Spaces, and it's written by a woman named Carolyn Finney, who is just an absolutely vibrant presence. She looked at the predominance of white privileged people in the environmental movement, the number of people who go to national parks in the United States. It's an American focus book, so it's focused on how Blacks interact with the landscape. And you know, I think the statistic I have in writing in her essay was, I think that there are 17, the population of the United States is, what is it, 17%, no, 14% of the US population is Black, but only 7% of them ever go to national parks. Well, why is that? That's an interesting question. You know, we can go back to John Muir, who helped establish it, and he wanted to create these wildernesses, but that wilderness actually was occupied by Native American. So it's never wild. There were people there and they just got displaced. He also, Carolyn writes in the, I am not shy in this book. I do step back and let all the writers speak for themselves. And actually what Carolyn says is very interesting. She is on the board of directors for the National Park System now. And what she said was, when I can find it, here it is. What would it be like if John Muir walked into a meeting of the National Park Advisory Board and saw me there as a member? Because when John Muir walked from Wisconsin down to the Gulf of Mexico, it was in 1867, and he talked derogatorily about Blacks and being lazy and not picking cotton as fast as whites could do. And I will not say that someone is of their time. I think that people could recognize others as human and not make comments like that. So there's a little bit of a dark history with John Muir, even though I'm a fan of his writing and what he did. I'm not a fan of all of his beliefs. So Carolyn Finney is somebody who will fracture your thinking about white privilege, environmentalism, access to the natural world. I walk all the time and I rarely see anybody other than white people walking around. I am in Britain, okay, and I am in Devon. I understand that, but I walk all over, and I just have never felt like people of color feel as comfortable as I do, and that's because of my privilege, of the color of my skin. I feel safe.
Sorry to interrupt you, Kathryn. It's interesting because, you know, I've been birding all my life. I mean, since I was 5, and I think in my entire life, I've only ever bumped into maybe no more than 7 Black people birding in my life. And I also notice when I go urban birding, for example, and there's large parks, like in London, you've got Epping Forest, and you find that the sort of people of color, the Muslims, and all the sort of immigrants, as it were, will be by the car park or maybe 100 meters in. And then once you get past that, there's none to be seen. I went to Sherwood Forest to do a piece for Radio 4. And I was walking around talking about the gnarled oaks and, you know, the wildlife there. And I turned and there was a Black guy walking with his partner. And I had to stop and say, oh my God, there's a Black person in the middle of Sherwood Forest. You know, I found it surprising.
How does that make you feel, David, though? How does it make you feel?
I feel sad because I think that there's a lot of talk about going to the countryside means that you're going to be walking straight into racism, and that's been in existence since I was a kid in terms of that thought. And I think when I look back, I never experienced racism when I went out into the countryside. I actually had a good time. I was looked at. I remember being in Scotland for the first time when I was 13 in the middle of the Cairngorms, wearing my bright yellow cagoule and my massive binoculars underneath my cagoule, so I look pretty. But people looked at me, but I think it's more a case of them looking at me out of curiosity. Oh, I've never seen, he's a black guy birding. I've never seen that before. It wasn't necessarily racism, it was more curiosity. And I found that, when my parents came to the UK back in 1959, 1960, as I said this before, it's all about getting food on the table, getting a job, getting a roof over the head. And, because the English countryside or even outside of your neighborhood was portrayed in a certain way by the media, it made you feel that it wasn't safe to get out there. You weren't safe to go out in these areas because you're out of your comfort zone. And, I think that's still the case now. I've been watching a lot of stuff on Twitter, and there's a lot of finger pointing going on at the moment by various quarters who are turning around and saying, yes, there's racism, and most people in the countryside are racist. And I think it's such an incendiary thing to say, because most people in the countryside, most people generally are not that blatantly racist like that. They're not. I've been out there all my life and I've never received it. And a lot of people saying these things, I've never seen them in the countryside, by the way. I've never seen them. So I'll get the impression that they are just talking about what they envisage or what they might have felt they've had or even had. Perhaps they have had that. But in the grand scheme of things, I think it's dangerous to be pointing fingers and to be accusing people of stuff, when I think it's more productive to sort of try and engage people and try to educate. When I was young, when I was 12, 13, even at that age, I realized that I was an ambassador. I was an ambassador for birders, I was an ambassador for black people, and I was an ambassador for humanity. And that was my role. And I was quite surprised the other day watching a program. I saw a program, Country File, which was on over the weekend. And they had a woman talking, and she was saying that, she basically said that she thought it was wrong for people to be an ambassador, or to feel that I have to be an ambassador for a whole race. Whereas I think it's not wrong. I think it's important that all of us are ambassadors for humanity, all of us. We have to have that role. And in that way, we can behave properly. So my feelings are quite strong on that. I feel, seeing that guy in his zone, I thought, great, I'm glad he's there. But, there should be more people out, because it isn't what you think it is. And again, I go back to the beginning, in that the media portray as if it is just for white people. So that's where this whole thing starts perpetuating again.
Yeah. Yes, my partner was having a Zoom meeting earlier. He's a professor of geology here at the University of Exeter, and he was having a Zoom meeting about bringing more diversity into geosciences. And a black scientist from the United States was speaking, and he said that in the last 40 years, there's been no increase in the number of black students in geosciences, in earth systems. And these are at universities where, we've had affirmative action programs and so forth. So even in this area, so I do think it's a structural thing. It starts with, what is the child interested in? Do they feel welcome studying about the landscape, or do they feel welcome studying this subject? And so I think it's really, really complex. And I do have hope right now. I do think things will change with what's going on. I in my lifetime, I don't have memory of anything as tumultuous as we're experiencing now. So
yeah. Well, let's hope. I mean, I look at Britain, and I see a lot of, and I mentioned this before, newspapers that are kind of aimed at those ethnic groups. And I mean, there's two actually aimed at Afro-Caribbeans and Africans. And all they do is perpetuate this whole thing about, you have to be a sportsman, you've got to be playing football, you've got to be doing rap. There's no kind of alternative. It's like, that's what's expected of you. Go and do it, because that's what you're good at, and that's what everyone thinks you're going to be good at. And that's so wrong. And I think if the papers that those people read, the media that those people trust, in inverted commas, is telling them that, then there's little hope. So a lot's got to change, and it's not just about pointing fingers one way. We also got to look at ourselves, all of us, and see how we can improve and how we can make things much more open for everyone.
I think I think the word is being an anti-racist, and that you are actually putting into action beliefs that help change the systems, you know. And I've done that. I am committed to all sorts of things. I've just changed a paragraph on my website today as an anti-action, anti-racist plan. And so I hope I'm doing my part.
Yeah, I've got a little message here from Nay and John. It may not be racist, but it isn't. But isn't it sometimes a pain to be other? Wouldn't it be nice just to get on and be you without being a curiosity? Let's hope that changes. I sometimes feel very aware of myself when I'm walking in nature as a white woman. I don't want to feel shy or cautious. I just want to enjoy it, which I do, but always feel slightly, a slight edge of anxiety. And I understand that because, you know, I mean, a lot of racism that I've experienced in my life has been outside of the nature world. And you get to the point where you feel nervous. I mean, especially when I was younger, feeling nervous about walking behind a white woman at night in the street. I would deliberately cross the road because I wouldn't want her to think that I'd be trying to snatch her handbag or something. And even to this day, I feel strange if a woman says, "Oh, just check my handbag for whatever." I feel strange thinking I might be accused of something, you know, and that's not good to feel that. But that's how, you know, that's how you've been kind of indoctrinated, really, in a way, in terms of how you should behave. For a long time, I felt dirty almost. I felt ashamed of my colour when I was a kid. I was called names, you know, from the age of, well, from primary school, which is 5 or 6, all the way through to the end of my secondary school, 15, 16 years old. I was called names practically every day. And, you know, early doors, I realised that it didn't really affect me in that I didn't feel upset by it. I just felt sad whenever someone started saying those things. I felt sad because I thought, you haven't got much to say about yourself or anyone else. And it kind of makes you, but it still makes you feel nervous in a way. You feel, well, not so much now for me now, because I've kind of lived my life a bit, but when I was younger, I felt nervous in terms of being in certain groups, thinking, I don't want them to think that I'm a mugger or what have you. And, you know, as a young man, I remember once dating a white girl, and we were together for about a month or something. And then she turned around to me one day and said, "Look, I can't see you anymore." And I said, "Why is that?" "Because my dad doesn't like black people. You can't come to the house. So you can't, you know, it's over." And I felt sadness, not so much because we broke up, but sadness because of the reason why we had to break up. It's just very, well, you know, and that's why I kind of think to myself sometimes when people are shouting and hollering about racism now, and I think to myself, well, okay, it does exist, of course, but I personally had it a lot worse than you guys are talking about now, in Britain anyway. But I don't need to talk about it because I don't have a chip. For me, I try and use that as fuel to be positive. I use that to try and get people engaged and thinking differently. I'll give you one quick example of being an ambassador. I remember leading a tour in Scotland on the Isle of Mull, and we went to I was taking one client, and we went to the guest house, and the woman who ran it was automatically very snidey towards me, very sarky, quite sharp towards me, but I just gave her love. I thought there was a problem with her, I just gave her love. But then after the 4th day, I said, "Right, okay, we're leaving, can I pay you?" And she said, "Yes, but can I have a quick word with you?" So she took me to another room and she said, "Listen, I want to apologize to you. I've been really horrible to you and I really want to apologize." I said, "No problem." She said, "But listen to me." She said, "I used to live in Zimbabwe. We were forced out by Mugabe and all those guys. I remember once being knocked to the ground and someone had a gun and they were about to shoot me. And I can't remember if the gun jammed or something, but anyway, she wasn't shot. And she hated black people from that moment on. So I turned up in her place in Mull, and she just hated me immediately. But then when she then turned around to me and said, "But the thing was, I realized how wrong I was because you are a really nice person. And I realized that I've got to judge people as I see them and not as how I thought a whole group of them were." And she broke down and she said, I just want to thank you." So I gave her a hug and then moved on. And that was a beautiful moment for me, for both of us, because it was a moment of realization.
Well, thank you for sharing that with all of us. It's heartbreaking. I'm sure a lot of us have tears in our eyes.
Dennis Brown, Dennis Brown, he's a reggae singer. Dennis Reardon, I feel sad about the lack of diversity of people experiencing nature. There is too much fun to be had watching birds, seeing butterflies flitting from flower to flower and so forth. Why should it be only white people that can have that fun? Well, that is totally correct. I think you're right. Kathryn, can I ask you another question?
Yes, please.
In terms of writing, by the way, guys, you got to get this book. I know it's not about selling a book, but you got to read her book because I think you've written it really beautifully. What advice would you give to people? I mean, there might be people in the Zoom room now that might want to express themselves on paper, you know, to write. How do you become a writer?
Oh, the $1,000,000 question. You sit at a typewriter and bleed, then the words come. Well, some practical techniques are you always go out with a little notebook and a pen. There's a wonderful, America's favorite poet is Mary Oliver, and I focus on her, and one chapter is devoted to her. So I got to follow in her footsteps in Cape Cod, and she had a curious habit of hiding pencils everywhere in the landscape, so that no thought would go unrecorded. And I have to say, when I was in Cape Cod around Blackwater Pond, I was trying to just take in everything so I could convey it to the readers. And I did do that. I had a great weekend out there, but I was seriously looking for pencils. Like, I really wanted a Mary Oliver pencil. So I never found one. I revealed to the reader I did not find one. So go prepared to catch your thoughts. Your thoughts will come and go. And so you use your camera to record things. I'm quite visual, so I always have my phone ready to photograph something, so I can remember details. I'd carry a notebook, use the recorder, because your ideas are like butterflies, and you need to catch them like with a butterfly net before they fly off, because you'll think, oh, I'll remember that, and then you don't, you know. So and then I have before I started this long distance morning running to hear the birds in the morning, I'm a lark, I'm not an owl, so I get up quite early, and my habit is to from 5 a.m. to 7:30 I sit and write, and then I do other things for about 2 hours, and I come back, and then I peter out around 4 o'clock. So I never ever write at night. But when I'm writing something, I've written 3 books, and I write, long form essays. When I'm in an idea, I'm absolutely dedicated to routine. I think there's a lot of freedom in the discipline of a routine. And also, writing is rewriting. Nothing comes out brilliantly the first time. It's just massaging it and read your writing aloud to somebody, or have them read your writing aloud to you, and you'll hear how awful it sounds, and what you need to change. So there are lots of techniques, and I do mentor people. So if anyone needs a mentor, go to my website. I'm happy to help people.
Yeah, I'm signing up.
Okay. Yeah, but don't be too hard on yourself. It takes a couple weeks to write like 5,000 words. It takes, a couple, 3 weeks for me to write a Smithsonian essay will take, a couple weeks of research and a couple weeks of writing and massaging, and then rewriting and rewriting and rewriting. So there's a myth that, writing sort of comes out of someone's, mellifluously like a bird. It doesn't. For some people it might, but nobody I know, nobody. So it's a craft, and I work at it.
Good. Would you like to do another reading?
Pardon?
Would you like to do another reading?
Sure.
Before we do it, we're going to do it differently. I'm going to basically ask you a couple more questions.
Okay.
I want to then tell everyone what's happening next to give you time to find your piece to read, and then you can read us out, yeah? So the questions I want to ask you are, firstly, what's your favorite bird?
Right now, my favorite bird is probably the sedge warbler. It's, you know, not too fancy looking, but I love the cacophony and it's just, and I love it really is, it bounces in between the reed grasses. I also happen to like cedar waxwings. I think they're beautiful. So I do like songbirds for sure.
Because the sedge warbler reminds me very much of the American worm-eating warbler. Worm-eating warbler, because it has a similar stripe on its head as well.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Okay. And notwithstanding COVID-19, where on this planet would you like to be right this very second, if you could?
Right this very second, I wish I could be back on my farm in Washington State, in the middle of a salmon spawning stream, surrounded by black cottonwoods and looking up at the eagles that have been nesting there since the week we moved. So yeah, that's where I would be, because I spent many happy years there, 15 years. So.
Right, whilst you're finding your page, let me just tell you all, Zoomers, what's happening over the next couple of weeks. We've only got 2 confirmed people, actually, even though there's a few more yet to come, including people like Nick Baker, who's the well-known, he actually lives in Devon as well, well-known TV presenter, and he'll be talking about insects. We haven't got his date yet, but in the diary for next week, we've got Kate Jones next Thursday. Kate, or Professor Kate Jones, to give her a full title. She's totally all over bats. She's all about bats. So she'll be talking to us about bats of Britain. It should be really interesting how to find them and all that sort of stuff, and she studies them. And then the following Thursday the 9th of July, we have a guy called Chris Wood, who's one of the top honchos at eBird, which is the app that people use to actually say, you know, to write down what they've seen, and it goes towards a whole massive database that sort of plots the populations of birds around the world in real time. And I'm sure he'll be showing us some really fascinating graphics of that happening. So tune in for those 2 guys. There's going to be more people coming, so keep looking at the site to find out who's coming. And the other thing I forgot to do, which I should have done right at the very beginning, because I was so excited about seeing Kathryn. In many ways, doing these in conservation words, it's almost like being on a date. And I don't mean being on a date romantically, it's being on a date intellectually, because I'm so excited about learning something different. It's like a real blessing for me to be talking to such talented people across a whole spectrum of different disciplines. So it's amazing. But I must mention that this whole In Conservation With series is sponsored by Leica, Leica Nature and Birding, and also by King's Place, which, King's Place Music Foundation. And this year, it's King's Place, who are based in King's Cross in London, are doing an Nature Unwrapped season until the end of the year.
I was hired to speak there before the lockdown.
Well, there you go. So that's our connection. And they've sponsored the whole thing. And plus, I am doing a walk for them in October. It's called Walk with the Urban Birder, King's Place, on Saturday, the 3rd of October. And you can book a space, and it's on the chat now. So it leaves me to hand over to you, Kathryn, for your quick read.
Okay, so I'm just going to read so this is the book again. Thank you for having me on. And it's beautifully illustrated, I have to say. So I'm going to read to you. I hope you can see this. Look at this is Vita Sackville-West here. Look at that gorgeous red hat. So since I'm a garden historian and landscape designer and a nature writer, I have to tell you about read a little bit of about Vita Sackville-West, and it's a short read. And I'm sure many of you have been to Sissinghurst. So she's well known for Sissinghurst, and I think I can't read the very last sentence, but her living legacy. Her name, Vita, means life, and Sissinghurst is a wonderful living legacy to leave behind. I didn't mean to make it so alliterative, but there you have it. Okay. Vita. I worship dead men for their strength, forgetting I was strong. That's a quote from a poem. Like many passionate gardeners, I was smitten with Sissinghurst Castle Garden long before I set foot there. Less than a century old, but old world atmospheric, the garden entices from afar and lingers with you long after you leave. Elizabethan ruins crumble in an ancient hunting ground, surrounded on two sides by a moat, and a spiral staircase up a fairy tale tower invites breathtaking views of the gentle Weald of Kent and insights into how its creator, Vida Sackville-West, liked to be surrounded by evidences of time. My first visit to Sissinghurst was a long time in coming, a full decade after moving to England. It was an afternoon stop on a July road trip with my sons, August and Selin, then 19 and 13. After a morning journey from Devon to Kent, we left the motorway for narrow country roads, then even slimmer country lanes. As soon as we walked through the arch of the brick house, the boys broke off together. Strolling in the yew walk and rose garden, I would occasionally glimpse them diminishing down long evergreen corridors. Leaving them to their own adventures, I turned to Vida's library, her study, and her gardens to learn as much as I could about this intriguing woman. Victoria Mary Sackville-West was an English poet, novelist, travel writer, and gardener. She was born in 1892 and published more than a dozen collections of poetry, 10 nonfiction books of travel and biography, 13 novels, including her 1930 best-selling The Edwardians, and her 1931 All Passions Spent. In 1913, she married author, diarist, politician, and diplomat Sir Harold Nicholson, 6 years her senior. Theirs was famously not a traditional romance. They were peripheral members of the counterculture Bloomsbury group of artists, writers, and philosophers, and their 50-year union was complex and kind, an open marriage allowing both to pursue discreet, yet occasionally and accidentally not so discreet, same-sex lovers while maintaining an aristocratic mirage of tradition. Vida would become known for her passionate relationships with dozens of women, including writers Violet Trefusis and Virginia Woolf, whose 1928 feminist classic Orlando, about a gender-shifting poet who lives for centuries, was based on Vida and her family history. And of course, in time, Vida would be known for his exquisite creation at Sissinghurst. But her passion for landscape and place had tragic roots. As a Sackville, one of England's oldest families and brothers in arms to William the Conqueror, the West came later, Vida grew up in her family's magnificent ancestral home of Knowle, probably England's first calendar house, with its 7 courtyards, 52 staircases, and 365 rooms that sprawled across 4 acres in a sweeping 1,000-acre deer park in Sevenoaks. She was the only child of Baron Lionel Edward Sackville-West and his cousin Victoria, and male-to-male primogeniture rules prevented her from inheriting Knowle. Instead, upon the death of her father in 1928, Vida watched this treasured home and estate, along with the title of Baron, go to her uncle Charlie. If only she had been a he. Her attachment to Knowle was the strongest bond of her life, and its loss was acute. Based beyond the opulence of material treasures, lush tapestries, silver tables with matching candlesticks and mirrors, Jacobean staircases, detailed headboards on curtained 4-poster beds, Knowle held her family history. It was where she could see her own deeply hooded blue eyes in portraits of her ancestors. Knowle's wilderness was the setting of her childhood, where she wandered widely, climbed trees with abandon, played in leaves, and collected bird eggs. Knowle, she felt deeply, was a living, breathing family member. She wrote, "I knew thy soul, benign and grave and kind, to me a morsel of mortality. Losing Knowle was Vida's greatest life sorrow." And then I go on another few pages, but that gives you a sense. And each chapter has beautiful excerpts. We got lots of permissions that we had to deal with. So it's filled with exploring the landscapes, and I take people into Vida's purple garden and into the hot garden, the purple red garden, and down by the moat, and I go up into the staircase. So I really bring people into Vida's life and her literature. So I'll leave it there. That's just a little excerpt, but that's from, and there are 25 of those essays. Yes.
That's absolutely brilliant, Kathryn. Thank you so much for sparing your time this evening to talk us through your new book and also your philosophies and just talking to us basically. Really enjoyed it.
It's an honor. Thank you, David, for having me.
And Zoomers, thank you too for being here tonight. I hope you enjoyed Kathryn. Well, all that's left for me to say is take care of yourselves, and hopefully I'll see you again at some other In Conservation With. And in the meantime, don't forget to keep looking up.